Hello everyone, my name is Taimur Rahman, and in the first article of this course we're looking at Theories of Globalization, Issues and Origins by Brian S. Turner. Now, as I said in the previous video, globalization has become a field of study itself, and what Brian Turner attempts to do is try to give you a sort of literature review, an overview of all that has been written in all the important debates with respect to globalization. Turner himself thinks that a Marxist sociology, which recognized the importance of international trade, economic imperialism, transnational corporations, and capitalism as a world system of exploitation and production, and gave rise to concepts of underdevelopment that have played a very key role in our understanding of the relations between the first world and the third world, may not be sufficient to understand globalization in the cultural domain and in the domain of ideas, etc. Hence, he refers to various works like Marshall McLuhan, who coined the term global village. We have Edward Said's Orientalism. We have Hodgson's work on Islam as a world history. We have Barry Axford, the global system. We have George Ritzer, the McDonaldization of society. And we have Tony Spivey on the globalization of world society. In other words, there is a vast amount of literature which looks at globalization not purely from the economic point of view, but more importantly, perhaps from the cultural point of view. When we look at globalization, it may be useful for us to borrow a terminology from theoretical physics. In theoretical physics, we have the idea of time and space being one thing, space-time we call it. So it's useful to think of globalization as a kind of space-time compression. What we mean by that is that the world is becoming smaller in the sense that we can travel around the globe. Means of transportation have become enormously advanced, and we can circumnavigate the globe quite easily in today's world, and it's becoming easier and easier to do so. And perhaps more importantly, we can talk to each other across the globe within nanoseconds. And so in that sense, both time as well as space have become smaller in the sense that we can talk to each other, we can visit each other, we can see each other, or at least a section of society can do so. This gives rise to a global consciousness. Now, when globalization first emerged, especially in the 1990s, people thought, many people wrote that there was a sort of euphoria around globalization. Many people thought that globalization, would result in the flowering of human rights. It would result in greater democracy. It would result in global peace. And political philosophers looked back to the era of Enlightenment, to works like Immanuel Kant, who spoke about a realm of perpetual peace. They thought that globalization would result in the end of nation states and the development of some sort of world government which would bring about the end to all war. It would result in a global civil society. As you may recall, Samuel Huntington was even so confident as to assert that the history itself in terms of the evolution of ideas had come to an end, and market economies and parliamentary representative systems would come to pretty much dominate not only all of mankind currently, but pretty much all of history as it would unfold in the future. Now, Samuel Huntington pretty much threw a bucket of water on all of that with his article and later his book called Clash of Civilization, in which he argued that cultures, in fact, would begin to clash, and civilizations built around cultures would begin to clash in this era of globalization. That sparked off a furious debate about what the nature of the new conflicts would be, whether they would be based on ethnicity, whether they'd be based on religion, and how they would unfold in the coming period of history. Anthropological research has largely focused on and explored the cultural complexity of hybridity and what we call globalism, which is basically a term putting globalism or global and localization together, so globalism. And post-colonial cultures continue to talk about, and in post-colonial literature, we continue to talk about cultural imperialism, adapting either to sometimes we have these very utopian ideas about what would happen in the period of globalization, and sometimes we have a great degree of pessimistic nostalgia for a more traditional world. So these are some of the debates that have unraveled in this particular period. Religion plays a more and more important role, ironically and strangely, in this period of globalization. It seems that more and more people are coalescing around their identity in terms of religion, especially I think this can be asserted with respect to the Muslim world. previously, I think in the 1990s, it was thought that religions would gradually just wither away and not play a very important role in terms of politics. But that has not been how things have evolved. Perhaps the most important debate with respect to globalization has been about the role of the nation state. Many people, many authors and scholars have asserted that nation states are now more and more archaic forms of organization that came into existence in the 20th century and should now wither away in the period of globalization as a world government comes to consolidate itself. But having now experienced at least 3 decades of globalization, political scientists and others are asserting that that was perhaps premature. Nation states continue to play a very, very important role. Whether we call them nation states or we call them states, because most nations are actually multinational states. But in the debate around political science, we still refer to them as nation states because ostensibly they are organized around a dominating nation, whereas in fact that's rarely ever truly the case. But anyway, so the idea of cosmopolitan democracy is in the last two decades or so being increasingly challenged, in fact, by an aggressive and resurgent nationalism. Whether we talk about Donald Trump, who won the election on the basis of the slogan, "Let's make America great again," or we talk about Le Pen in France, or we talk about Modi in India, it seems that nationalism is resurgent rather than retreating as was originally thought in the 1990s. And we have new right-wing parties in Europe that are also resurgent, that are largely organized around the idea that migration should stop. They are against the policies of open migration, and they are largely considered to be anti-immigration parties, or their politics is considered to be anti-immigration, although they themselves would say, no, that's not what our agenda is, but Europe ought to be for Europeans, which roughly translates to the same thing. So the idea of this transnational global citizenship, this promise of transnational global citizenship, which many thought would emerge in the 1990s, has not really emerged. At the same time, there's an enormous debate about cultural hybridity versus cultural standardization or homogenization. In the 1990s, there was a great euphoria around the idea that we would learn from each other's cultures, that Indian culture would travel to the United States and vice versa. We would learn about the various cultures that exist within Africa. But I think today there's greater skepticism about this, and people think that that was maybe utopian. And what has come into being is more of an Americanization or westernization of society rather than an equal exchange of cultures and ideas. There's also an enormous debate about how to define globalization, because the way in which you define it, of course, we scholars and academics love to define and redefine things. We endlessly define a term and then redefine it just because we think that will help us understand things better. And sometimes there isn't a lot of consensus about these definitions. But any perhaps definition of globalization would have to account for, or at least examine or look at, the growing frequency, volume, and interrelatedness of cultures, commodities, information, and peoples across both time and space. Secondly, it would have to look at the increasing capacity of information technologies to reduce and compress time and space, giving rise to notions such as global village, some call it a global pillage, but anyway. Thirdly, it would have to look at the diffusion of routine practices and protocols for processing global flows of information, money, commodities, and people. Fourth, it would have to look at the emergence of institutions and social movements to promote, regulate, oversee, or reject globalization. So anti-globalization movements are also very much part of the process of globalization. And finally, it would have to contend with the emergence of new types of global consciousnesses or ideologies of globalism that give some expression to this social interconnectedness, such as cosmopolitanism and the idea that we are all part of a global community. There is also another debate about postmodernity, and the debate is about whether globalization can be understood as the further development of modernity, or whether globalization itself encompasses a new era that we should refer to as a postmodern era in our politics. Anthony Giddens examines the processes of globalization. He says globalization can be captured by 3 processes. The first is time, space, distantiation, disembedding and reflexivity. It is really the modernization of modernity. At the same time, he argues that there are four elements within globalization: the economic production of commodities, the surveillance and control mechanisms, the organization of violence and extraction of resources from the environment. And four key institutions accompany this kind of globalized modernization. These are capitalism, new surveillance technologies, military power, and industrialism. There are four dimensions of globalization, he argues. You can see Anthony Giddens loves making lists. Those are the dimensions are the world capitalist economy, the nation state systems, which are a key part of globalization, even though early scholarly work about globalization thought that globalization would end nation states. But in fact, the nation state system plays a very key role in the process of globalization itself. Also, we have with that the world military order and the international division of labor. Giddens thinks that there are four high-risk consequences of globalization. The first is the collapse of economic growth mechanisms. Second is the growth of totalitarian power, nuclear conflict, and finally ecological disasters. Pretty bleak list of risks of globalization, but nonetheless, these are some of the significant debates that we're having today. When we scan the landscape with respect to media and the information revolution, we see that the media that has come to dominate in this period of globalization is a very commercial kind of media. It's a commercial global media, and its purpose is largely to entertain rather than to educate the public. It creates mass audiences, but those mass audiences are created on the basis of the lowest common denominator, and that determines the quality of production. So this new mass media in the period of globalization isn't trying to, its main object is to get as many hits and as many likes, as many shares as possible, and that can happen where you pitch something at the lowest common denominator, not necessarily at the highest common denominator. Not that those kinds of productions are not taking place, but they are not as frequent as productions in which that are geared towards getting the highest likes and hits and shares and so on. So the mass media tend to be what we would call consistently passive rather than creating an active citizenship, even though we have social media today in which people themselves are content producers, but in fact the content producers are merely only 1% of the total users in any in the social media as a whole. Turner also talks about reflexive modernity, that is the modernization of modernity. What that means is that we are becoming more and more aware of our own modernity and debating it. With respect to media, finally, there's a wonderful expression by Wyndham Lewis who talks about the medium being the message. And of course, this is one of the key aspects of global culture today, that it's not so much the content of that is perhaps as important as it used to be. But what has also become very important in the world today is not just what is being stated, but who is saying it and how are they speaking. Those become important questions. Globalization has really also altered the way we think about education. We would hope that there'd be a greater sharing of knowledge across the globe and so on. But we have also seen that research design more and more is dominated by corporate interests in the world today. We can see that research design and research, national research strategies are not really based around national strategies, but based more around global corporate interests. In fact, some 60% of fundamental research now takes place outside of the university through various other corporate sector funding sources and financial sources. At the same time, institutions have undergone a fundamental transformation in the last 30 years, educational institutions. Education, which was considered to be outside of the market and outside of ideas of the market, have experienced an enormous change in their pedagogical approach. Today, students are seen more as customers, and faculties are seen more as, and teachers and professors are seen more as providing a service to students rather than the old traditional idea of being a master and apprentice of a particular discipline or subject. At the same time, we've seen that the approach and attitude that young people have, and even scholars today have, towards any given discipline has changed dramatically. And one of the key things that's changed is how we acquire knowledge. For example, today We acquire knowledge in small strips and bits of information rather than reading entire books or volumes of books. We get little tweets from everywhere. We get little posts from everywhere. And that's how we accumulate information. So what that means is that the way we accumulate information today is kind of non-linear. You can enter at any stage and exit at any particular stage. There's no necessary accumulation or hierarchy or structure of knowledge as people like to approach it today. Not that that's necessarily a good thing. Sometimes it can be good, but in all the cases what that can mean is that you don't build up a body of knowledge, building on foundations, etc. But you get bits and pieces everywhere. One of the negative aspects of this is plagiarism. Plagiarism has become more common in the world today with information technology, with it becoming easier to take little bits from here and there, reorder them, rephrase them and just insert them here and there. And also, authorship has become almost impossible to monitor. These educational systems in the contemporary knowledge society are typically also post-disciplinary in the sense that postmodern global classification would appear to be characterized by its incompleteness and instability. Categories are fluid and unstable, and most importantly, knowledge can be not just self-referential, a little random, but you can enter into any given field at any point that you wish to and exit from that field at any particular point that you wish to exit from. So that means that knowledge has become, or the method of acquiring knowledge in this era of globalization has become very non-linear, fluid, and perhaps even unstable. Another very important aspect of globalization that we will continue to discuss is the question of empire. And that specifically relates to what's going on, let's say, in our region of the world, what's going on in Afghanistan, what's going on in the Middle East, let's say in Iraq, and what's going on globally with respect to neoliberalism as a global economic system, as a global economic order. Sometime in the 1990s, pretty much every country that one can think of implemented what we would consider to be, or what we would call, neoliberal reforms. Third world countries went through structural adjustment programs, they privatized, they liberalized their economies, they opened up to foreign trade, and they destroyed any protectionist barriers to foreign trade that they had erected in the 60s or 70s. So from the perspective of economic history, liberal or neoliberal strategies sometimes only work after countries have economically already gone through a period of protectionism and successfully developed their economies. Germany and Japan are great examples of economies that built themselves up after protecting their own economies and then opened up to the world, etc. And in fact, in the 60s and 70s, this was almost taken as a given by most economists. This was the dominant paradigm. Today, we live in a world, economically speaking, where far more than at any other time in history, what happens in one part of the world impacts the rest of the world. But it's not the case that this is, of course, equal everywhere. What happens in the United States, for example, will impact the rest of the world far more than what happens in, let's say, Botswana or Angola, etc. So the economic downturn of 2008, the economic crisis of 2008 had an impact all over the world, and impacted economies all over the world, impacted the global economy all over the world. And this, of course, is something quite different and new, although, of course, things in one part of the world did impact things in the other part of the world previously in history as well. But the scale and depth at which it happens today has not occurred previously. If you find some of this stuff, obvious and self-evident, perhaps even banal, I don't blame you. I'm just kind of summarizing what Turner talks about. But these are things that have become common knowledge today, and we've become accustomed to them. And I am only talking about them because we will be talking about them through this course. Connected with the discussion on empire is the question of surplus extraction from the third world. The main problem for underdeveloped societies is that they have sometimes no surplus that can be even usefully extracted. Many countries, sadly, in the context of Africa, have become dumping grounds for waste that's produced or sometimes nuclear and toxic waste that's produced in the first world countries. At the same time, first world countries have moved, particularly societies like the United States, have moved from being competitive manufacturing production centers to becoming consumer centers, credit centers, and sort of like command and control centers of an economy that is all over the world. The manufacturing actually takes place in the third world, and in the control of that manufacturing occurs in the first world. And this is giving rise to growing inequality between the first world and the third world, but even within the first world. For example, we can see the rise of a permanent underclass in the context of the first world. We can see that there are inadequate health insurance for some 47 million Americans. In 2005, America ranked 27th in amongst 163 nations on the Index of Social Progress and Male Life Expectancy. In the US, male life expectancy is actually now lower than it is in Costa Rica. And we can see that that is because of the way in which manufacturing has been moving out of the United States into China and other parts of the world. So finally, the expectation in the 1990s was that we would create a borderless world, we would create a multicultural society, we would create a cosmopolitan society, we would evolve into a global village, the Cold War would come to an end, we would have world peace, we would have a society with human rights and democracy all over the world. But many people today are much more skeptical about globalization. They say that globalization has also created a society with closure, with entrapment, with containment. It has created a society with a massive information gap, a massive digital divide, an information divide, and even a mobility gap, a mobility divide in the world. It has created greater inequality, and it has led to a new kind of aggressive nationalism and even religious fundamentalism. It has not resulted, perhaps, in fulfilling the utopian promises of the 1990s. Why was it the case that globalization did not fulfill its promises? That is what we will be examining in this course. Hope you enjoyed that lecture. Thank you so much.